Hi guys, welcome to my quick crash course in React. So React can have a pretty steep learning curve when you're just starting out. Not because it's necessarily too advanced, but because sometimes the concepts can be so different from what you've been learning with JavaScript and HTML that it can be a little bit confusing to pick up a new way of doing things. And that's exactly what React is. So really my goal is that if you want to go from React is confusing, it's a complete mystery to me, to I can actually build something in React, I know this crash course is going to help you do that. My assumption, of course, is that you've learned some JavaScript basics, you've already built some small projects with JavaScript, and you may have even tried React before. So in this crash course, we're going to cover what actually is React and why it's used, how and why React allows you to use something called components, what things like state and props really mean, how to handle user inputs and events in React, how to use React Router, right? How to break out of single page using React Router. And we're also going to make our own React logic using custom hooks and even talk about what hooks are as well. This crash course is really about helping you understand how and why React works so you can feel like you know what you're doing. Lots to cover, so let's get into it. So let's start with the basics. What is React? Well, the textbook answer is that React is a JavaScript library for building apps and websites. But I mean, what does that even mean, right? Well, what it actually means is React helps you to build apps and websites like Lego, right? In pieces. Now, why would you want to build a site like Lego? Well, when your sites actually start to get quite large, you don't want to have to continuously copy and paste or rebuild the same code that you've written previously over and over again. So for example, you don't want to rebuild the same like nav bar over and over again. You don't want to rebuild the same button over and over again. Even the same card layout over and over again, right? It just becomes too cumbersome and it's just not an efficient way of working. React, on the other hand, it allows you to build once, create something called a component out of what you built, and then you can reuse that component. You can import it into any file, drop it wherever you want, just like Lego bricks. This really ends up making your code so much easier to manage. So the ability to create components in React is really one of React's superpowers. And a component is basically a function that returns some JSX, which is just HTML and JavaScript together. It's React's way of writing HTML inside JavaScript. And so here's what a simple component looks like. This is just a component that returns a H1 heading that says, hello, Jake. And that's a component, right? Of course, they can be much larger than this, even have entire sections inside it, but this is a basic component. Then when you want to use this component in other places in your app, you just call it like a custom HTML tag. So you import it in your file and now it shows hello Jake wherever you put it, or hello whatever your name is, right? JSX might feel weird, especially if you've mainly been writing in HTML and JavaScript, but once you get used to writing JSX, it starts to feel more natural. And so what is JSX, right? JSX is a syntax extension. Basically, it's a way to write HTML-like code inside JavaScript. And React uses JSX to render components, right? To use components. So here's a very quick example. You can notice here the name part, that's JavaScript inside JSX, right? You can use JavaScript inside HTML when you put JavaScript inside curly brackets like this. So you're blending HTML structure with JavaScript logic. It does look kind of ridiculous at first, right? But it gets super convenient once you get used to it. Okay, so now with components and JSX in mind, how does React actually work? So to get a little bit technical for a second, React creates what's called a virtual DOM. So basically a lightweight copy of your real browser DOM, right? Your document object model. And every time your app changes, like when a user types in something, React figures out the smallest possible change that it needs to make. Instead of reloading the whole page or re-rendering a massive chunk of HTML, React just says, okay, only this one component changed, I'll just update that. And so this makes your app feel very fast, right? Even when it's updating in real time. Now you don't have to fully understand the virtual DOM to use React, but knowing that's what makes it efficient helps everything else make sense. And when your websites get really big, allowing React to only update single components allows your site to run so much faster. That really is one of the superpowers of React. So now let's pause for a second. We've just gone through a bit. You might be thinking, wait, this is a little bit challenging. It looks so much different to what I've been using already. And yes, I have to say, at first, it's going to be challenging to wrap your head around this, because if you're new to web development, it does flip a lot of the things that you've been learning about, how to build interfaces before. Instead of writing a big static HTML page and adding your JavaScript to it, React, it essentially wants you to think differently, right? It wants you to think in components. It wants you to treat your app like a system of interactive pieces working differently together. each with their own logic and responsibilities. And so it will be awkward at first, right? But once you start to build bigger and bigger projects, you'll start to understand more just how important building like this is and how much more organized and faster it is to code like this as well. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's build a really quick React app to start putting all this to work and see how it works, right? So step one is setting up your React app. React projects are usually started or bootstrapped using a tool like Vite or Create React App, often shortened to CRA. So downloading tools like Vite with your React app, it helps to set up all the files and configurations that you normally have to do manually, like installing React yourself, right? Like setting up a development server, like wiring everything together. You don't have to do any of that now. When you download a tool like Vite, it allows you to just start coding your app without worrying about all the behind scenes setup. So it's really quick. So you're going to open up your terminal and you're going to run npm vite latest, and we can call it my first React app, and then hyphen space hyphen template React. And then we're going to go into that project by going cd my first React app. Then you're going to run npm install and then npm run dev. And so that last command actually starts your development server so you can see your React app in your browser. So now you want to just open your browser and go to your local host. Mine is 5173. And then just like that, your first React app is live. So on the browser, you'll see something like your Vite plus React and a spinning React logo. And so that basically means that you've officially made it to level 1 of building your React app. So congratulations. So the second stage now is really to clean up some starter files. So when you download Vite, it gives you a bunch of extra stuff to help you get started, but you really don't need anything. So we'll just clean it up so we can get a bit focused here. So you want to delete your app.css file and even the logo.sgv file. You just don't need these files. And then in your app.jsx file, we're going to replace the code with this. Just a very simple function that's going to return hello React. And now when you reload the page, it should say hello React on the page. And so what you've done is you've actually created your first custom component. It's really impressive, right? Maybe not so much, but at least you've got your first React app created and our first component. And so one thing I want you to note is that it's important to write the export default app at the bottom of the page or at the bottom of your file, or just have it on your page. You actually don't even need to write at the bottom. You can write up at the top. And if you don't write this, you'll not be able to import this component into other files and even use this component at all. Okay, so now let's move on to state within React. So what even is state? So in plain English, state is really just data that changes over time. So in React, state is what allows your component to respond to user actions, to API responses, or anything dynamic that's happening. So for example, it helps you with a counter value. It can help you with a list of to-dos, or it can even help with a user typing into an input field. Without state, your app is just basically a static page. With state, it becomes interactive. So let's talk about how state works, right? So the hook, or basically the function that makes state happen, is called useState. And so to use state, we have to import it into our file like this. So import, open some curly brackets, useState from React. And so now we have the hook useState that we can use into our file. So let's start with a simple counter state function so we can use the useState hook. So we're going to call a variable const, and it's going to look a little bit weird. We're going to open some brackets. We're going to put count as the first variable, and we're going to add set count, which is going to be the function. And then we're going to equal that to useState and the number 0. So let's break this down properly. So useState, and we've got the number 0 in there, sets up a piece of state called count, and it gives it a starting value of 0. So count becomes 0. And it returns two things, right? It returns the current value, which is count, and the function, which is setCount, the function setCount to update it. So when you call setCount with the new value, React then re-renders the component with the new state value. And you can think of it like this. So this line of code, it's like saying this, let count equal 0. And then with this function setCount, we're saying to tell React to update the UI with this new value. And so unlike regular variables in JavaScript, React keeps track of these values between renders and it updates your UI automatically. Okay, so now that we've done that, with this in mind, let's build a simple mood toggle app just to drive this point home. So we're going to use state to let users choose a mood. So we're going to import use state. We're going to create a function called mood selector. So we're going to create our use state hook. And we're going to set the mood to happy as default, right? The mood is going to be set to happy. And so now each time a button is clicked, the site updates and React re-renders the component with the new mood. So if we click on happy, you can see the current mood is happy. If you click on neutral, you can see the current mood is neutral, and so on. So there's no page reloads here. There's no DOM manipulation. It's just clean and it reacts to the updates. Now you can also allow two components to use the same state, which is called lifting state. And I'll put an example of that up on the screen here. Now both components you can see here are talking to the same source of truth, the state in the parent, which is app. So this is one of the biggest mind shifts in React, right? Instead of spreading data all over the place, you basically lift up the state so the child components can access or update it through props. And we're going to get into props in the next section. So this concept is called lifting state up, and you use this if two components need to access the same state. It's a bit more an advanced topic, but I thought it's important for you to know. So let's move on to props. So if state is what gives components memory, then props are what let components talk to each other by passing data between them. So props basically stands for properties. It's just a fancy way of saying we're giving this component some custom information to work with. And you've already seen this idea before, right? Long before you touch React. So take this line of plain HTML code, for example. That tag, src or source, is a property. You're telling the image where to load it from. So in React, it works the exact same way, but instead of passing props to built-in HTML tags, you're passing props to your own components. And so here's a simple parent plus child example. So what you can see here is that the app is the parent component. Greeting is the child component. Name Jake is a prop. So React gives that function greeting a propped object that looks like this. So when greeting runs, it displays hello Jake. That's basically all props are, right? They're just input data passed from a parent to a child. And so you can even clean up the way that you use props with something called destructuring. So this line, function greeting props, and it returns hello props name, is often written like this with curly brackets. So function greeting, open up curly brackets, name, return hello name. You don't necessarily need to write props dot name. This allows the code to look a lot cleaner. It's called destructuring, and all it means is that pull name directly out of the props object. It's the same result, it's just cleaner code. So you don't have to call your props props. You could technically do this. You could add cheeseburger as a prop name. It still works, but everyone, including you, 3 days from now is going to be completely confused. So it's probably not the best way to do this. So if you are going to name it, stick with props, or you just destructure it, right? You don't have to use props at all. It's just a common way of writing, and trust me, your future self is going to thank you for it when you're going through your code. And so props allows you to reuse the same component with different data. So let's say that you want to use that greeting for 3 different users. Each call sends a different prop. So the greeting component stays exactly the same, but now your UI will just say, hello Jake, right? Hello Emily, hello Chris. That is really the power of props. You build it once and then you reuse it everywhere. Okay, so moving on to forms, events, and inputs. Now, if there's one part of React that gave me a lot of stress and headaches early on, it was forms. Because in regular HTML, a form just works. You type in an input, you click a submit button, and the browser does its thing. But in React, the input doesn't behave the same way that you expect. You can't just type something and forget it. You've got to control the input. You've got to handle the state, and you've got to wrestle with the event, which is e.target.value. So let's talk about it, right? So why are forms different in React? So React wants to control everything that happens in your app, including what's typed in the form. So that means you store the input's value in state, you update that state on every keystroke, and you read from that state when you want the input's value. This is called a controlled component, and it's React's preferred way of handling inputs. Here's a controlled input example. So let's break it down. Let's look at useState. We're starting off here with an empty string, which is a name, and it's whatever the user types. So value equals curly brackets name. This is what makes the input controlled. It means the value inside the text box should always match the name state. And so if you remove that line, React's just going to yell at you, right? It's just going to say something like, switch from controlled to uncontrolled, and it's not going to be very happy with you. And so now let's look at onChange equals handle change, which is the function here. Every time the user types, this function runs, which is function handle change an event, then set name event.target.value. So what happens is that grabs the new value from the input and updates the state with set name. And so ePrevent, the default function, by default HTML forms, they try to reload the page when you submit. This stops it from happening. And so you're probably just thinking now, why not just use HTML? Why go through all of this? Well, the thing is that in React, your app is built entirely around state, right? I think we've spoken about that previously. If you try to use a regular form in React, you'll have no idea what the user typed unless you grab the value manually using like reference, which is just not efficient, or you let the browser submit it and reload, which is basically not great for single applications that are using React because it messes with things like the navigation too much, and we're going to get into that. Or Or you can just lean into the React way, and that is to just use state. So let's use another quick example. Let's build a mini sign up form. So now with this sign up form, you can see that we're handling two inputs and both are synced with state. So here you have control, and your form can actually do something like send data to an API later. And so why this all really matters? Well, because in the real world, forms, they're not just for fun, right? They're very serious things. They're sign up fields, they're payment forms, they're search bars, they're contact pages. And React's controlled pattern makes them easier to test. It makes it easier to validate, and it also makes it easier to send to back-end APIs, which is super important. So using forms like this, make sure that you're not just telling the browser what to do, you are the person that's actually in control of what to do with the information. So we could probably keep going on about state all day, right? It's a huge subject within React, but it's time to move on to the next part, and that is routing. How to get your React apps out of just being in a single page. So let's talk about React and React Router. So what is React Router? So React Router is basically a library that adds real page navigation to your React app. So it lets you map URLs to your components. So example / your about page. You can navigate between pages using links, so without refreshing the page. And you can also build multi-page layouts like real websites. It's basically like giving your app a map so that React knows what to show when someone visits a certain address. So let's walk through building your first multi-page app with React Router, and I'll explain exactly what every line of code is doing. So we're going to build our app with 3 pages with a home, about, and a contact page. So step 1 is to install React Router. So in your terminal, you're going to run npm install React Router DOM. So this installs the React Router package. And the reason why you have to download it is because it's not built into React by default. It's an add-on that you have to install manually. So step 2 is we're going to wrap your app in a router. So you're going to open your main.jsx or your index.jsx file, and then you're going to update it like this. You're going to import React DOM from React DOM / client. Then you'll import your browser router from React Router DOM. And so this is to import the router. And then you're going to import app from your app file. And so here you're going to wrap your app in the router. So your browser router here is what lets React track the URL in the address bar. And so by wrapping your whole app in browser router, you're basically saying, hey React, this app is going to be using routing. Watch the URL and change what is shown based on it. And so step 3 is to create your 3 basic pages. We're going to create 3 .jsx files. And so we're going to call one home.jsx, we're going to call one about.jsx, and we'll call one contact.jsx. These are very basic pages, and they're each going to return, this is the home page, this is the about page, and this is the contact page. And see that export default, how I mentioned earlier, you can actually add it to the top of the page. You don't have to add it to the bottom of the page. And so each one of these is just a very simple functional component that returns a heading. And so you'll plug these pages into your routes. And so step 4 is to bring it all together inside your main.jsx file. So here we're creating our navigation bar, which has got our links. And so what's happening here, right? So the link to, which is we're linking to our home page. This is how you navigate in a React app, right? It replaces the usual ahref, so the ahref that you normally see in HTML. It replaces that tag and you replace it with link. And so clicking it doesn't reload the page. It just tells React Router to swap the view. And so routes is basically watching for the URL, right? It's kind of like a traffic controller. So inside it, you define which path shows which component. So basically with the about page, you're saying if the URL is / about, show the about component. And the same goes for the home page, and the same goes for the contact page, or if anything else, or any other pages that you add. So go ahead and try this out, right? So you want to try it out by running your app with npm run dev, and now go to your local server, and you're going to type in / about, and you should go to the about page, and type in / contact, and you should go to the contact page. And if you just have a / in front of your local host port number, then you will see that it goes to the home page as well. So you can click the links in the nav bar that we've got here and watch the page update without it reloading, and the URL will change as well. And so by doing this, you have officially created your multi-page React app and you're out of that single page hell. So congratulations. And here's just a bonus tip. Once you start to build your app out in React and you start creating more and more pages, you definitely want to make sure that you put it in some sort of dedicated folder. So for here, the example, we've got our source kind of main folder, and then underneath that, we've got our pages folder, and then we'll add our home, our about and our contact JSX pages all within our pages folder structure like this, and it keeps it nice and clean. And this also keeps your routes organized as well so that your app is a lot easier to manage. Okay, so the final subject I want to talk about today is custom hooks. And what is a custom hook? So a custom hook is just a function that uses one or more built-in React hooks. Like, we talked about use state. But there's other functions in React like use effect or use ref, stuff that we didn't really get into in this crash course today, but I'll create other videos on in the future. And so what these custom hooks do, or these custom functions do, is they package up reusable logic. And that's basically it. You're not inventing new functionality. You're just organizing and reusing logic that would otherwise get copied and pasted into a bunch of different components. And all custom hooks, they follow one rule. Their name must start with use. That's how React knows that they're hooks. So why do custom hooks even exist? So let's say that you have two components that both, let's say track whether the user's mouse is hovering or whether the browser tab is in focus, whatever it is. So you could write that logic in both components separately, but eventually it does get messy, right? When you've got the same logic that's been rewritten over and over again, it gets messy, duplicated, and it's very hard to maintain. So instead, with a custom hook, you basically just write it once and then you reuse it across your app like a utility function. So let's build a custom hook, right? We'll build a custom hook and we'll start with just this classic kind of toggle between true and false. And so the old way to write it would be like this. So we're going to call use state, and then we're going to create a toggle function, and we're going to set is open to is not open, right? Which is the is open function, which is set to false. And so we're going to set this to true. And so this is the old way of writing, where you would basically add this component to every place that you want to toggle between true and false. And so step one to create our custom hook is we're going to create a separate file. We're going to call it use toggle, and we're going to add in our function here. So let's break it down. So we're using the use state here to manage a Boolean, which is the true false. And we're using a toggle function that just flips between the value. And then we return both the value and the toggle, just like the use state returns the state and the set state. And so now you can import this hook anywhere. So we'll use the hook in a component, right? So to use the hook, we'll import use toggle from our use toggle file. And notice we don't have to write JS or JSX as well when we import it. We can just do, // and then our file. And so we would import the custom hook that we just wrote earlier into the file right here. And the hook looks like this. So when you call use toggle, you get two things back. You get the value, which is the true false, and you get a toggle function that flips the value. And so here we're defining the functional component, and this will render a button, and optionally it will also render a message as well if we decide to put a message in there. And so this line is really key, right? We're calling our custom use toggle hook, and we are destructuring the result into two separate variables. So is open, this is a Boolean that tracks if the modal is open or if it's closed. And then toggle modal, this is a function that flips between is open, between true and false. So this is how we normally usually write it, right? Which is to set our count and set count. But now we're getting that behavior from our own custom logic. So then obviously the component returns some JSX, just like all React components like we've been talking about. And this is the button that toggles the modal to open and closed. And so when it's clicked, it calls the toggle modal function, the function from our custom hook that we've created. And so the button text is dynamic thanks to this line of code right here. And so this basically reads, if is open is true, then show the paragraph tag, which is modal is open. Otherwise, show absolutely nothing. And so to summarize this component that we've just created, it uses a custom hook to track the simple toggle, like the open closed, and it shows a button that toggles the state, and it dynamically renders a message based on that state. It's clean, right? You can see that it's readable, and it's way easier to manage than rewriting use state logic everywhere. You just import your custom hook and you can use that toggle function wherever you want. And so without a custom hook, the same logic will look like this. It still works, it's just not very reusable. You'll have to write that use state plus toggle logic everywhere that you needed it. So yeah, it just gets really cumbersome and messy. So using your own hooks, your own custom hooks, it's a lot more efficient and it makes your code a lot more easier to read and to operate with. Because if you need to change the logic within your custom hook as well, you just go into your custom hook file and you change that logic and it changes it across your entire code base. So super easy. This is why React wants you to think more in components, more in pieces than anything else. And you can see the power of that, especially when you're using custom hooks. All right, guys, we have covered a lot. If your brain is feeling a little bit full right now, I don't blame you. We've gone through a fair bit. We started with some of the basics, talk about what React is, why it's different from building it the old school way with, JavaScript and HTML and CSS. We obviously broke it down into components. We spoke about JSX and state, which is basically the building blocks of every React app. And then we saw how state lets you make your app do stuff, not just display stuff, right? It makes your app dynamic. Learned about props and how they let components talk to each each other. And then we looked at forms and inputs where nothing works unless you manage the state yourself. And yeah, that part can probably feel a little bit confusing, but I think you handled it well, right? And obviously we talked about routing, right, with React Router, and how you can create real pages with real URLs and build an actual navigation experience, even with just the components that you build. And obviously we just talked about custom hooks as well and the importance of them. So hopefully this has given you a great kind of crash course, maybe even a refresher on React. You don't need to know everything about React to build real projects. What really matters most is that you just understand the core concepts, the core building blocks, and don't be afraid to go out and build things yourself and break things. That's all part of the process. The more you create apps and websites using, frameworks like React, the more they just become natural, and you kind of move away from more of your sort of simple, just JavaScript, HTML, CSS pages, and hopefully you're starting to see the real power of using something like React. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this crash course. That's all from me. I will see you in the next one.